Welcome back to the CV Brothers podcast. American comic books are broken down into different ages or time frames. This is done to make conversation easier and categorizing them more easy. The most famous of these is the golden age of comics. It started with Superman and is what most people see as the start of modern comic books. There was then the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, the Dark Age, and the Modern Age, or what's going on currently. Before the Golden Age of comics and the appearance of Superman, there was what is known as the Platinum Age of comics. However, I like to call this area the Proto-Superhero Age. During this time, there was a large number of writers and characters across a large spectrum of comic books, from detectives to superpowered heroes to horror stories to romance comics. Anything you can think of, it was there. It was in this landscape that Superman, Batman, and others were created. Most of these characters and heroes are known as pulp heroes. The Shadow, the Green Llama, the Phantom, John Carter of Mars, the Lone Ranger, etc. Without these heroes and their success, most of the comic book companies we know now would not have existed. This can be taken a step further when it comes to movies. In the 80s and early 90s, many of these old heroes received theatrical movies and TV shows. In effect, the proto-superheroes again paved the way for modern superhero films, the superhero genre, and the whole MCU. I started to think about these movies that I had watched so faithfully as a child: The Phantom, The Shadow, The Rocketeer, etc. I wondered why they never got sequels, and then I started to imagine what it would have looked like if they would have had their own cinematic universe. Some of the movies in this universe have already come out and needed only slight adjustments to fit into a larger narrative. Others needed larger changes to make them fit. As these stories came about, I started to enjoy the world more and more, and had fun creating new stories for these heroes. Some based on pre-existing ideas, some created out of whole cloth. I hope you enjoy this video. If you do, leave a comment. If you don't, leave a comment. Now let's talk about part 1 of phase 1 of the Pulp Hero Cinematic Universe. To give a little further clarification, I'm going to be talking about what movies these were actually based off of, just simply in name, and then giving the new title and the time frame in which these movies take place, so that you're able to gain a better understanding of how all of these characters and events either precede each other or are intertwined. The first movie is based highly off of the movie The Mask of Zorro from the 1990s, of course starring Antonio Banderas. In this version, however, we're calling it The Legend of Zorro, which takes place a little bit at the beginning of 1820, but more specifically in 1840s. Don de la Vega protected the people of Los California as the masked vigilante Zorro, until his identity was discovered by his rival, Don Rafael Montero. Montero attacked de la Vega's home and accidentally killed his wife. He then imprisoned de la Vega and took his infant daughter. The people were then left without Zorro for 20 years. Alejandro Merita and his brother Joaquim looked up to Zorro as children and wanted to be just like him. But when he disappeared and left them without hope, they turned to a life of thievery simply to survive. As his brother and his crew were in the middle of a job, they were attacked by Captain Love Smith. Alejandro was the only one to survive the attack, and without his brother and his friends, he quickly turned to drinking to simply wash his depression away. It was a drunken and depressed Alejandro that was found by a recently escaped De La Vega. The two agreed to train Alejandro to become the new Zorro, so that both of them could seek revenge and justice against Captain Love and Don Montero. Alejandro then posed as a Spanish nobleman to infiltrate Montero's inner workings. While doing this, they uncovered the secrets that Montero was planning, which was to dig up gold and buy back California to create his own nation and empire. Alejandro also met Elena, de la Vega's daughter, who had grown up her whole life believing that Montero was her true father. Through an interesting set of events, the two fell in love, and together Alejandro and de la Vega exposed Montero's plans and the truth to the people and to Elena. Together they stopped Montero and Captain Love Smith and brought them to justice and freed the people of Alto California. Jumping ahead to the post-credit scene, we see Alejandro and Elena sitting together with their infant son, Joaquim, telling stories of Zorro. They told him that whenever the people of California needed Zorro, he would be there to protect them. The Shadow, of course connected to the 1990 film The Shadow with Alec Baldwin. Even further connecting back to the pulp hero The Shadow, who was a crime fighter that wore all black with little strips of red and used his psychic powers to defeat evil. The Shadow, 1925. Following the First World War, Lamont Cranston set himself up as a drug kingpin and warlord in Tibet. He was a trained soldier, but fell into criminal life due to the need and due to greed. He was later then abducted by Tukul, a powerful monk who had been trained in the mystic arts and had learned to control his psychic power. Tukul offered him a chance to become a force for good rather than evil. Cranston was then trained to use his psychic powers and eventually decided to return to New York to begin fighting crime there. He took up the name The Shadow and became feared by many criminals of the city. At first he started simple and just began lurking in the shadows, taking out small-time criminals to learn what was truly going on, to not upset the balance of things too quickly. It was during this time that Shiwa Khan, a former student of Tukul and a descendant of Genghis Khan, came to New York to complete his ancestors' plan of total domination. Cranston realized that the force he was sent back to combat was Khan. Shiwa Khan used his powers of psychic abilities to quickly ingrain himself in the mob in the underground world, preparing to use his plans to take over the world and simply using the mob as a tool. While uncovering Khan's plans, Cranston met a socialite and a telepath named Margot Lane. Shiwa Khan had convinced her father and others to build a bomb to kickstart his conquest of America and then eventually the world. Margot and Cranston began working together to stop Khan and to save the city. Margot was able to convince her father to stop building the bomb, while Cranston took it upon himself to fight Khan. Cranston was eventually able to overpower Khan and lobotomize him. This, in effect, stopped his connection to his own psychic abilities. Not his knowledge of them, but his ability to use them. Khan was then put in prison. Cranston and Margot began their relationship and joined forces to fight the criminal underworld as The Shadow. Post-credit scene. Khan awoke in a padded cell of a mental hospital, one which the doctors had put him in after he had tried to exclaim his mental abilities and his descendancy from Genghis Khan. They then told him that they were able to save his life by removing just a small portion of his brain that seemed to nullify his psychic abilities, if you believe in that thing. After the doctor left the room, a shadowy figure walked in and asked Khan about his powers and the techniques in which to develop them. The Raiders of the Lost Ark, an incredible movie made famous, of course, by Harrison Ford, which spawned several movies, books, TV shows, video games, etc. In this universe, however, we are simply starting with the first story of Indiana Jones. Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, 1936. Indiana Jones is a professor of archaeology and an adventurer of a college in Belford, Maine. He is contacted by the U.S. government to help locate the Ark of the Covenant, the fabled protective case which held many relics and mystical powers of the ancient Jewish people. The U.S. government tells him that the Nazis are trying to accrue all different relics and powers from different religions and from the occult to try to use it in their conquering of Europe. Therefore, they want the U.S. to find the Ark before Hitler and the Nazis can. Indiana first travels to Tibet to recruit an old flame named Marion Ravenwood. After some tension and some conversation, they were able to agree upon finding this together. They then traveled to Tunis, Egypt, where they found that the Nazis had been digging. They also were able to determine that the Nazis had been digging in the completely wrong area. Not just a little to the left or a little to the right. They would have never been able to find this tomb without the items in which Indy and Marion were in possession. Before they could get any closer to the dig site or enact their plan, Marion was captured and then presumed dead in an explosion. Indiana and his friend Sala then put together a small group of people and eventually found the Ark, only to have it taken by the Nazis. However, they did find Marion in the fact that she was alive, just simply being held by the Nazis. Marion and Indiana chased after the Nazis and the Ark and were able to recapture it. However, they themselves and the Ark were then later captured. The Nazis found a simple island in the Mediterranean to try to open up the Ark and see if it actually was what it says it could be, a power to be used against the Allies. Knowing his history and knowing somewhat of faith, Indiana and Marion closed their eyes and tried their hardest not to gaze upon the Ark or what was inside of it. However, the Nazis, being curious, received the full wrath of God and were destroyed, leaving only Marion and Indiana surviving. The Ark was then taken to the U.S. government and returned to the people who had originally contacted Indiana. However, Indiana and Marion were both very frustrated with the fact that the Ark was being kept by top men and studied rather than being able to be shown to those people who truly understand it, archaeologists and people of religion. The U.S. government simply just said, "We will keep it safe," and then simply put it in a warehouse to gather dust. However, Marion and Indiana decided to live for the moment and began to start a life together, as this adventure had rekindled their love for one another. Post-credit scene. At home, a few years later, an older Indiana answered the door and was greeted by a older shadow. Lamont then told Indiana who he was and his wishes to have a conversation about some of his exploits and what the future might hold for both of them within this country.